Oh my god, folks, we've got two new colossal minions, and they're both neutrals, and they're both awesome characters. This is Ozumat, a new 8-mana 6/5 beast with Colossal +6. I love we're getting like a full board Colossal. I feel like a lot of them only summon one thing. This actually feels big and colossal. And he's got a death rattle that reads, for each of Ozumat's tentacles, destroy a random enemy minion, and the tentacles are going to be 1/3s in this case. So first things first, this is just a gigantic play on board, like a ton of stats, a lot of health to deal with, could be a bit awkwardly shaped unless you just have a good AoE to wipe it. You know, one flame strike handles it, but if you don't have that AoE exactly, a lot of stuff to trade into and deal with. And you've also got this friction aspect from this death rattle where your opponent kind of needs to deal with all the tentacles before they deal with the main body of Ozumat, or they risk losing their own board. Not every deck's going to care about that because they won't have a board. It might be pretty easy, but sometimes that could be a little bit frustrating and hard to deal with. There's also things you can do, like maybe give Ozumat taunt, and then like that's guaranteed to stick. Maybe you could kill the Ozumat off immediately. Maybe you could just proc the Ozumat death rattle without actually having killed it. Doing all these things gives Ozumat like this board clear potential on top of this board threat potential as well. I should also note, sometimes just going big and wide like this could be great for a class like Druid. Just love summoning wide boards and then buffing those boards later. So there are quite a few different ways to use Ozumat, and I think a few classes can activate one of those ways to get this death rattle off successfully. Others are just going to be happy sometimes to discover this thing, stumble into it, and just have a big old board built off Ozumat that creates a lot of problems. Because this is a 12 damage threat on board, essentially, and just a big pile of problems for your opponent, which I think means Ozumat might actually find a home in a real deck. So moving on here, we've got Neptulon, the Tide Hunter. He's moving from Shaman to neutral, although he still feels pretty shaman-y, I have to say. 10 mana, 7/7 elemental minion, Colossal +2, and his colossal parts are the hand, Neptulon's hand. They are 4/2s, and they are immune while attacking. Neptulon also has Rush and Wind Fury, and whenever Neptulon attacks, if you control any hands, they attack instead. So this is a really interesting minion, and a lot actually going on. A lot of text there squeezed into that card box. So you play Neptulon. He's a 7/7. He has Rush and Wind Fury, right? You're basically attacking twice, you assume, into your opponent's stuff. But instead of Neptulon attacking, the hands are going to attack instead. And presumably both hands are going to attack with each attack, because it says they attack. It doesn't say like one hand attack. So you're actually going to be dealing 8 damage, I believe, per attack with the Neptulon. So it's actually kind of better than the base stats of 7. That means you could maybe clear 2 8/8s with Neptulon while still preserving all 3 minions, because the hands aren't going to die to the trades. Neptulon himself is not attacking. So, you know, clearing a couple big things off your opponent's board and being left with this really threatening position yourself as well, with 3 solid minions and a big scary body and Neptulon himself. It's one they can't really leave around with. Wind Fury could hit face for 14 were it to survive at a future turn. So this kind of has like Onyxia vibes a little bit, right? You've got stuff that's being summoned with Rush, it's taking trades, there's some immune plays there. I will say I think the shapes of this are a little bit more awkward than Onyxia, because you really just get 2 attacks with Neptulon. So if your opponent has 3 or 4 minions on board, he becomes far more awkward to deal with. Whereas with Onyxia, you're getting a full 7 attacks. You've got the 8/8 body fully immune to take a big attack out. And then the 2 ones can kind of line up better math, perhaps, to take better shaped trades. So I do not think this will have the sort of general use case of Onyxia where a lot of decks can run this. It's comparable, just a worse version, and can decks really afford to run both Onyxia and Neptulon? There will be a point way in the future when Onyxia has rotated and Neptulon remains in standard format about a year from now. So maybe that could like slot in as a replacement Onyxia down the road, but that feels pretty far off and hard to predict. In the meantime, though, I still think Neptulon is a really relevant card when, you know, put in a deck randomly, discovered randomly. Like, this will be a card that feels good to play in a lot of various board states. I just don't think a lot of decks will be able to sustain both him and Onyxia and to make a lot of sense. That said, there's one angle that's like maybe a big deck where you don't need to worry about battle cries for Onyxia. You could just summon this from your deck and it's still a pretty good big card, essentially. So in that case, I think Neptulon has that one angle to be played immediately, but we haven't seen a lot of big decks succeed in this current meta. Things would have to change for Neptulon to make sense there. So next up here is the Snapdragon I covered earlier in the news post, but we'll go in a little more detail here. This is a new 3/3 neutral minion for 3 mana with a crazy Battlecry, honestly. Give all Battlecry minions in your deck +1/+1. So if you're running a ton of Battlecry minions, or maybe exclusively Battlecry minions, this is kind of like a 3 mana COLOSSALS, and you could run 2 of these, frankly. That said, we've had a few of these COLOSSALS style effects lately, and they just do not seem to keep up in modern day Hearthstone. The payoff of all those things in your deck being buffed, it takes a lot of card draw, it takes a lot more mana to spend to really realize the benefit of those stats, and Hearthstone tends to emphasize stats being put into play more immediately, or more reactive stats faster. So that's a little scary for this card. I think it's hard for it to compete there. There is, though, this world where you can just get big enough sometimes. Like if you play multiples of these, you start chaining the battle cries, you've got Macaws, you've got Bolner. You could, like, you know, get 4 or 5 of these effects off and eventually just have this enormous deck, everything buffed a ton, while still using Battlecry minions that maybe offer some tempo, some reactivity to help you keep up. So you might just kind of overwhelm people over the course of the next 4 or 5 turns into the mid to late game. I think that's going to be pretty hard to set up and hard to reliably pull off. And if you don't hit your Snapdragons early, like, that's not going to work. And that's one class use case. So I just think Snapdragon's going to feel too slow in most cases, and there's this kind of deck building check too to have all these Battlecry minions. I don't think most decks are going to want to sustain that. So you kind of have to go all in, I think, to make Snapdragon worth it. The odds of that working well, I think, are pretty slim, even in that all-in scenario. So as kind of big and flashy as this looks at first glance, I don't think it makes sense in standard format. There might be some cool stuff in duels, doing like a Battlecry build around for a card like Snapdragon, but standard, I just don't see how this one's really going to make the cut. All right, next up here we have the Bubbler, a new 1 mana 2/4 elemental neutral. After this minion takes exactly 1 damage, destroy it. Pop. You pop the bubble. It's kind of gruesome. If you think about it, this poor guy just absolutely destroyed, exploded. But interesting little card here that effectively makes this a 2/1 in some scenarios. You know, if your opponent has a ping or a 1/1 laying around, this is effectively 1 mana 2/1, which isn't all that exciting. But in a world where they don't have handy access to exactly 1 damage, this really does feel often like a 2/4. So maybe your opponent plays a 2/2 and your Bubbler trades into the 2/2 and is left behind as a 2/2/2/1, depending on what they gain access to. So you could argue this is a way to like kind of keep early game boards in check, or maybe like encourage or elicit a hero power out of your opponent for maybe a little bit of inefficiency on their side. And that's all kind of intriguing sounding, but it's hard for a deck to commit to that sort of game plan for a minion here that otherwise doesn't really offer a lot of upside. We have other 1-drops that offer a ton of upside that this is competing against. Think about like the new Naga 1-drop that's like scaling a ton of attack, presents these crazy lethal threats for aggro decks for only 1 mana. Bubbler doesn't really seem to have that upside. So, you know, even in something like a token deck where this gets buffed a bunch, or that's kind of a liability that can be so easily killed off. You know, I think there's like exactly that first turn scenario where it's okay at best. So that's going to leave Bubbler a pretty hard card to fit into a deck. And just in case anyone thinks, this can still die to normal damage. Like if it hits, if 4/4 hits it, it's dying. It's not only dying if it takes 1 damage. That's hard to read into that, but I know some people will catch this 1 damage thing and think it only dies to 1 damage. It is not immune unless it takes 1 damage. It just also dies if it takes 1 damage. So don't try to plan any crazy shenanigans off of that. The 1 damage becomes a downside actually as this gets buffed and gets bigger. So that won't really work as an out for Bubbler either. All right, next up here we have the Coil Fang Constrictor. This is a really interesting card. Kind of does a lot of things. It's a 4 mana 5/4 neutral beast. Battlecry, look at 3 cards in your opponent's hand and choose 1. It can't be played next turn. So straight up, this is kind of a disruptor / staller card where you look at an opponent's card and say, nah, I don't want to deal with that next turn. And you buy yourself a turn not having to face off against that card. So kind of 3, I think, base ways to use that. There are essentially ways to disrupt combo cards. If your opponent has some combo, you know they're about to pop off on their combo. Nope, you can't play that combo card next turn. I'm going to find lethal or do something else in the meantime to eat that card later. Number 2 is just disrupting, I think, a removal card. Like you build a big board early, you plop this on 4. Your opponent can't play Brawl next turn because you play Coil Fang, you pick Brawl. Brawl is limited for a turn. You get 1 more turn to overwhelm them with your board full of stuff. And then number 3 is just disrupting, I think, curve cards. So, you know, you play this on 4, they either have a 4 or 5 drop they want to naturally play on curve next turn. You pick the 4 or 5, they can't play on curve. So 3 different ways to work there. I think some are more exciting than others, and different decks would need different ones. Indeed. There's also the upside here of just information. You get to see 3 cards in your opponent's hand, so you gain a little bit of reconnaissance value, essentially, where it's like, okay, I know what they have. I can kind of figure this out over the next few turns. I need to play around that other card they have, even though I'm not picking it for right now. And then there's also, like, you know, Shaman can do some crazy battle cry synergy. It sounds really fun to, like, build the deck where you're just playing this over and over again, or maybe multiple times in a single turn with Bolner. And it's like, no, actually, you can't play any card next turn. That sounds not maybe competitive, but ridiculously fun all the same, just completely locking out their hand. So all of that is attached to a pretty decent body. A 5/4 on 4 we found out works okay with a card like School Teacher in this meta, so you're maybe not sacrificing too much. Now, I will say, despite all of that awesome stuff, not every deck is going to care about this. They're just not going to need this sort of effect. They're just rather going to play like a big aggressive 4-drop thing that's, you know, the better follow-up for their aggro deck, or a couple smaller cards for their aggro deck to really swarm and overwhelm, or just curving into face damage instead because they're just getting ready to kill you very soon. So, you know, not every aggro deck's going to need this to disrupt the brawl, for instance. Like, you know, an aggro Demon Hunter wouldn't have run this, Drekthar aside, when aggro Demon Hunter was really good, and I think that'll remain true for future aggro decks as well. So it's going to be hard for some decks to kind of slot this in or figure out the space for it. Could be a tech card for a control deck. If there's any battle cry synergies, it might be kind of a freebie. But a lot of decks have more like directed game plans and proactive game plans, and they're less about messing with your opponent's stuff and more about just executing your stuff. And this doesn't really often help you execute your stuff. You're just kind of hoping and gambling because you're only getting to see 3 cards anyway. You might not find the combo piece. You might not find the brawl. You might just kind of pick 3 cards that aren't really that relevant at all. Just get some random thing that didn't feel really all that disruptive much. And then you played like a lost Tall Strider. So there are some real risks to running a card like this. So despite all that upside and all that craziness, I still feel like that's mostly going to live in sort of fringe decks, maybe like a one-of tech card. Does not feel like this is going to be everywhere in the meta, despite all the things it can do, because I'm not sure it does anything super well enough to like make the cut in an actual deck list. So really fun card, really interesting one, but I think if you're worried about seeing this everywhere, I wouldn't be quite worried yet. Might be bad for Hearthstone if it was. I think a lot of people get frustrated by this card, as much fun as I would personally have playing it. Ozumat is a 4-star card. Neptulon the Tide Hunter is a 3-star card. Snapdragon is a 2-star card. Bubblebot is a 2-star card. Coil Fang Constrictor is a 3-star card. And there you go. That wraps it up for review number 1 for the Throne of the Tides mini set. We got reviews all weekend over the next 3 days, so stay tuned. I'll probably keep it to 1 review a day. It seems like they're coming out in pretty consistent chunks there. So each afternoon, pop out a review, afternoon my time anyway, here in the US. We'll pop out a review to talk about the latest cards. That's it. Thanks as always for watching. Share your thoughts on these cards in the comments below. And until next time, game on.